Hello, this is Mrs. Jacobson. Today we're focusing on Chapter 3 from our textbook. It covers ecosystems and what they are and how they work, with a special focus on ecology. I'd like to give credit to Stephanie Beck, who made the slides for this show. The first big idea we're going to cover is ecology, and ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and with their environment. Often you hear ecology defined as how organisms, the abiotic features of an ecosystem, interact with one another and also with their abiotic environment. So thinking basically ecology is study how everything is connected and interacting. All right, so we've talked about this in the past, but life is organized into a bunch of different layers, essentially. From the atomic level, really focused in, to atoms making up molecules and those making up cells, knowing that all living things are made of one or more cells, even down to something as simple as a sponge living in the ocean is made of one or more cells. And those organisms make up populations, a group of organisms that also make up communities where you have different populations together, which form ecosystems, and then all the ecosystems of Earth make up the entire Earth's biosphere. So a population here is members of the same species that live in a particular place at a particular time. So it's the who, where, and when. The variation among members of a population is due to its genetic diversity. So you can have a whole bunch of deer or antelope, and they don't all look alike because they're not all the same, but they're all part of the same species. For example, we're all Homo sapiens, we're all humans, but we don't all look alike. And the variation amongst humans is due to this genetic diversity. If we go up a level from populations to communities, a community is all the populations in an area. So all of the different species that live in a given area. It could be population with tide pool creatures where we see urchins and sea stars and algae. That's part of a community, all those different populations that are interacting with each other. So that could be their feeding relationships, the competition, the nutrient cycles, all of those different components. Going up from community to ecosystems, an ecosystem is the community plus all the abiotic factors in that particular area. So communities of living things plus those interactions with living and non-living, the abiotic factors. And finally, the biosphere is all the ecosystems of our entire world where we live. So we talked about biomes already. The biosphere is just a whole bunch of biomes interconnected. Okay, bringing it back to the cellular level, we know that all living things are made of one or more cells. And what I'd like you to know is that cell types matter. Obviously, if it's an animal, it's going to have animal cells and not a rigid cell wall. And plant cells help plants to stay upright with those nice cell walls. So you should know the basics about the different cell types and what that means for organisms. All right, on to big idea number 2. Aside from ecology, we should know that life is sustained by 3 basic things. And we've been looking at food webs lately. The 3 things that life is sustained by are the flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere, the cycling of nutrients within the biosphere, and obviously gravity keeping everything here on Earth. Make sure that you take notes and write those 3 things down. The flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere, it's constant. The cycling of nutrients within the biosphere, we talked about biogeochemical cycles and that the law of conservation of matter, what is here remains. And finally, gravity, as we all know, keeps everything on the biosphere. All right, so there are 4 spheres of life. All 4 spheres interact with each other, and we need all 4 to stay alive. The first is the atmosphere, or the air. And the second is soil and rocks that make up the crust. The third is the water that we have continually cycling around the planet. And finally, the fourth is the biosphere, all living things. And this is the same stuff that you look around outside and you know it's all there. Air, soil, living things, and water. All right, let's talk first about the atmosphere, and that's the air surrounding the surface of Earth. Obviously, it's what we breathe too. The closest layer of the atmosphere here which goes from ground level to about 4 miles up, depending on where you are. It can go up as high as 11 miles, but it's called the troposphere. So it goes troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, and actually out externally it's called the exosphere. Notice they're all spheres because they're all circles. Let's talk first about the troposphere here. It's made primarily of nitrogen, as we know. About 78% of the troposphere is nitrogen gas. 21% is oxygen gas. And then the rest is made up of the larger greenhouse gases like methane, CH4, carbon dioxide, CO2, water, and then, of course, nitrous oxides and other trace gases. All right, so above the troposphere, the next layer up is the stratosphere, and as you can see, it's about 11 to 31 miles above the troposphere. The stratosphere, the most important thing to know about the stratosphere is that within it is the ozone layer. And you probably have heard of the hole in the ozone or seen some of these images with people with a Band-Aid there trying to fix that hole. The reason why the ozone layer is so darn important is that it filters out about 95% of the UV radiation coming from sun to earth, which means that without that filter, without that ozone layer, we would all be just frying in the sun's heat. So again, ozone layer in the stratosphere, and it absorbs the UV radiation. Above the stratosphere is the mesosphere, the thermosphere, and the exosphere. And as you can see here, the temperature really varies depending on where you are within the atmosphere. We're not going to talk much about the thermosphere and exosphere. We're going to focus here on the stratosphere and the troposphere, the closest ones to Earth. All right, the second sphere, obviously the hydrosphere, meaning water sphere. So all the water on our planet Earth. And water takes on many forms, as we know from the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. First, it can be a liquid on the surface or underground. It can also be frozen in glaciers or ice, and also in the atmosphere as water vapor. Most of the water on the planet is in our oceans. In fact, 71%. It covers 71% of our planet's surface area. All right, the next sphere, which we've already covered, is the geosphere. And remember, the geosphere is all those layers of the Earth, starting here with the super hot core, the inner solid core, the outer liquid core, this nice thick mantle, including the upper mantle that's part of the lithosphere, and the crust here at the very surface with those moving plates. Obviously, the geosphere contains all of our fossil fuels and minerals. Those are the non-renewables, as well as the soil, which is our renewable resource. And finally, the biosphere. This is all living things on Earth. Life exists from approximately 6 miles above the Earth's surface, where things are flying around, to the very bottom of the ocean. Those extreme animals and protists that live at all these different layers of our biosphere. Let's remember the 3 things that sustain life. First, the flow of energy, the constant flow from the sun. Second, matter cycles through in those nutrient cycles. And third, gravity, which keeps everything on the Earth. So let's talk briefly about the flow of energy. We know that it all starts with the sun, and the sun is a perpetual resource, so it's constantly shining on the Earth, whether it's day or night. It's somewhere, it's shining on our planet. The good news for us is we have this ozone layer within the stratosphere that absorbs 95% of incoming solar radiation here. Some of it's reflected by the atmosphere back, and then the rest is absorbed by the Earth. So the greenhouse effect is essentially, that's important because it's heat radiated by the Earth and reflected back down. It's actually trapping that heat. The greenhouse gases reflect the radiation that's radiated by the atmosphere as heat. The more greenhouse gases we have out here in the troposphere, the more heat is going to be trapped and radiated back. And we'll talk more about this in class. All right, so as we know, the sunlight that reaches the surface warms the planet up. That's good, because otherwise we'd be a frozen planet. Drives the water cycle, right, because it's heating and evaporating water, and generates wind, because you have unequal heating around the globe. Of the energy that makes its way down, only about 0.1% is used by plants and protists for photosynthesis. So very, very small amount of that incoming radiation is actually used by those green chlorophyll-containing plants and protists. All right, big idea number 3, and this is my favorite part. Ecosystems are made up of both biotic and abiotic components, including producers, consumers, and decomposers, and that really drives all of the action in the biosphere. All right, let's talk food. Again, one of my favorite things. Trophic level simply means feeding level. You have 3 main types of things that go into any food chain or food pyramid, and that's the producers, like plants and protists and those things that have chlorophyll and make their own food, or autotrophs. You've got the consumers, the heterotrophs, that have to get their food from something else. And then you have the decomposers, those things that are making soil out of dead material. All right, the first thing I'm going to talk about is producers. Obviously, they are the start of all food webs. The sun brings its energy to these producers because they are autotrophs, meaning they use photosynthesis to make their own food. They don't need to rely on others for food. So they're self-feeders, autotrophs, meaning auto-eating, automatically eating. Mostly these are plants, some algae, and lots of plankton in the water produce a huge amount of oxygen for us to breathe. They take in carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water, and make their own food, their own carbohydrates that they then use. Some don't go through photosynthesis, but rather go through chemosynthesis, and those are bacteria like at deep ocean vents. But again, here is your photosynthesis equation: carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, leading to carbohydrates and oxygen for us to breathe. These are our producers. All right, unlike our producers, our consumers, or other feeding, heterotrophs, they need to eat other things or consume producers, other organisms, for energy. There's lots of different levels of consumers, from primary, secondary, to tertiary. And as you can see here, primary consumer, this deer is eating the plants. Here, the mouse, these are all consumers. So there are various levels of consumers, and whenever you do a food web, the first thing that is an autotroph that's eating the plants is the primary consumers. Those are herbivores and sometimes omnivores if they're eating plants. So for example, I could be a primary consumer if I'm eating plants as a human, even though I'm an omnivore. So again, the first consumers in the food web, they eat the producers. So rabbits, cows, horses, grasshoppers, all those herbivores are definitely primary consumers. And then also, if an omnivore is eating a plant, that would also be a primary consumer. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. So secondary consumers could be omnivores or carnivores, as long as they're eating animals that are eating plants. So for example, an omnivore would be a secondary consumer like me. I would be a primary consumer eating lettuce and a secondary consumer eating something like chicken, because the chicken would eat plants and I'm eating the chicken that ate the plants. Carnivores are always either secondary or tertiary consumers because they only eat other animals. All right, tertiary consumers are those animals that are eating secondary consumers. So we call tertiary consumers anything that's above a secondary consumer. So a tertiary consumer could be third in line in the food chain, or fourth, or fifth in line, but usually our food chains don't get that big. But we call those all tertiary consumers. So omnivores, carnivores that are eating beyond the secondary consumers. And finally, we look at decomposers. Most decomposers, 99% of decomposers, are bacteria and fungi. And they like to eat dead organisms, and they get their energy from those dead organisms. They feed by excreting enzymes that break down the dead organisms, and they then return those nutrients in the organisms to the earth and essentially create soil from those. Notice 99% of decomposers are bacteria and fungi, not a lot of other consumers in there. And finally, we have the detritivores, or detritus feeders. These are things that are eating initially the dead organisms. So unlike decomposers that are usually fungus or bacteria, these are organisms like this turkey vulture that eats dead things or wastes, like the dung beetle here. And they're kind of the first thing to eat those dead things before the bacteria and fungus break it down to soil. Okay, so this is the first question that's going to go into your notes. And the question is, what's the difference between decomposers and detritivores? Here's a decomposer, here's a detritivore. write the answer in your notes. We are now halfway through the video, so if you want to take a break, and we'll get into part 2. There are many levels of consumers, as we talked about: primary, secondary, tertiary, and of course organisms can occupy more than one level at any given time. The example of myself eating a chicken salad, the lettuce, I would be a primary consumer, and eating the chicken, I would be a secondary consumer. These bears here are an example. If they're eating blackberries, they're a primary consumer. If they're eating fish that ate a plant, they would be a secondary consumer. And if they ate a fish that ate an insect, they would be a tertiary consumer. All 3 different types of consumers these bears can be at any one time, depending on what they're eating. All plants and animals go through respiration. Respiration is essentially the opposite equation of photosynthesis. Carbohydrates plus oxygen lead to breathing out CO2, plants do it too, production of water, and energy, usually heat energy. So as I move through the day, I burn the calories I eat, and the oxygen I breathe out CO2, I sweat or breathe out water molecules from my mouth, and I'm producing heat energy for my body. So both producers and consumers go through respiration, and that's the way that we harvest and use the energy from our food. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen, whereas anaerobic respiration does not need oxygen. All right, the second summary check involves these 3 questions. So this would be question 2, actually, because we already had one question about detritivores and decomposers. What does a food web diagram show? What is the ultimate source of energy for most ecosystems would be question 3. And then finally, what is this exception to the second question? When do organisms not need that ultimate source of energy? Look back through the slides and come up with the answers and write those in your notes for questions 2, 3, and 4. All right, let's look at big idea number 4, and that's all about energy. Energy, energy, energy. It's all about food webs and ecology. So energy flows through ecosystems via food webs. Energy is also lost as it flows from one level to the next. So if we look at the dandelions here, they're eaten by the bunny, and that bunny is eaten by the hawk. The dandelions get 100% of the energy from the sun, only pass 10 to the bunny, and the bunny only passes 1% of the original energy to the hawk as it's eaten. Plants, animals, and decomposers make up food chains. We know this. A food chain is essentially a pathway that tells us what eats what. The sun gives its energy to the producers, which give their energy to the primary consumers, which give their energy to the secondary consumers, and then to the tertiary consumers. As they all die, they give their energy to the decomposer, and along the way, energy is lost as heat. Of course, these are very oversimplified models of nature. Food webs even are oversimplified, but this is a simplification of a food web. Here's a marine food web, and as you can see, humans are at the top here of that food web. We would be tertiary consumers. But this is a far more realistic way to show what's happening out in nature. There's lots of overlap and connections and arrows going in both directions, depending on what's eating what. Remember, food webs and food chains are showing where the energy is passed from one organism to the other in any ecosystem. The problem with a food web is that it usually can only go so far. So if you look, it usually doesn't go beyond the level of a tertiary consumer. You get these producers down here, followed by the primary consumers, carnivores, insectivores, other things as the secondary consumers, and then at the top, often, you end up with these large predators, which are the tertiary, or sometimes we call these quaternary as the 4th level of consumer. For our cases, we're just going to use tertiary consumers as anything above the secondary consumers. Why is it that food chains are so limited? And the answer is, it's all about energy. Every time energy is passed from one organism to another, some of that energy is lost or no longer usable. The amount of energy transferred from one level to the next is called its ecological efficiency. This is a good definition to put in your notes. Ecological efficiency is the amount of energy transferred from one level, trophic level, to the next. How efficient, how much energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next varies, but a good rule of thumb is the rule of 10. This means that 90% of the energy is lost as heat, and only 10% makes it to the next level, as I described with the dandelion, bunny, and hawk. Why only 10%? Because not everything gets eaten. There may be 1,000 pounds of clover here in a field, but the rabbit doesn't eat it all. Good thing, or else there would be no clover left to make new clover. That's the first reason. The second reason why we only pass 10% on to the next trophic level is that not everything that is eaten actually gets used or digested. So some of what you eat is lost as poo. And in fact, a gross fact here from animal grossology is that some animals actually will eat their own poo to get more nutrition and more energy from it. I think that's pretty gross. The third, and what I think is the most important reason why only 10% of the original energy is passed to the next trophic level is because energy is always being lost as heat. I repeat, energy is always being lost as heat. So when something does any kind of work, whether it's moving or breathing or creating seeds in the case of plants, it's creating heat. In your eco columns, those plants photosynthesizing are creating heat. And growing, they're creating heat. Your body, for example, is always working. Your heart's beating, you're breathing. Even if you're sleeping, you're creating heat energy. Because energy, only a certain amount is passed and it becomes more and more unusable as heat energy, new energy must constantly enter our system. This energy comes from the sun. Luckily, our Earth is an open system for energy. Sun is perpetual resource and it's always shining somewhere on our planet. We can show how energy is lost at each stage of the food web in what we call an energy pyramid. Here you have your producers, your primary consumers, and your secondary consumer. Here, looking at an energy pyramid like we just saw, the producers are always at the bottom. They produce the most and have the most available energy because they get it right from the source, right from the sun. As I stated in that original piece, the next level is the primary consumer. They only get 10% of the original energy from the plants. And since only 10% of the energy moves from primary producers to primary consumers, it takes a lot of producers to support those primary consumers. Lots of grass for those cows to be able to survive. And finally, the last level up here in this particular pyramid are these secondary consumers. We could also have one that has tertiary and quaternary consumers, but in this case we just have 3 levels. They again only get 10% of the energy from their primary consumers. So only 10 is passed on to our lion. All right, it takes a lot of primary consumers to support the secondary consumers. In this case, it's a tiger. Just like it took a lot of primary producers to support the cows, a lot of cows to support the tiger. All right, here's another question to put in your notes. You're going to put the answer in. So this would be question 5 from chapter 3 review notes. If there is 10,000 kilocalories of energy produced here by these producers, plants at the bottom, how much energy will make it to the zebras and how much will make it to the lion here at the top? So 10,000, only 10% is passed. So of 10,000, 1,000 kilocalories makes it to the zebras. And of that 1,000, only 10% is passed on to the lion. So lion only ends up with 100 kilocalories of the original 10,000. That's 1%. Notice as we go up in levels of our energy pyramid, we get less and less. It gets smaller and smaller because you have less and less energy available to the top consumers. As you can see here, numbers-wise, not calories-wise, but we would have 100,000 total grass plants at the bottom of our energy pyramid, which would give their energy to only 1,000 voles, which would give its energy to only 1 owl. So as you can see, the total number of each of these organisms gets much, much smaller as you go up to the top of that food pyramid. Sometimes our food pyramids look a little silly, and that's simply by the amount that these caterpillars are going to eat. So you only have one oak tree here, but it produces a lot of energy for those caterpillars. So you end up with 1,000 caterpillars, and then again, much fewer of the birds, and much fewer of the top consumer, that sparrowhawk. When it comes to the mass of everything, or biomass is the mass of living things in any given ecosystem, you can see that our numbers always start off and are pyramid shaped. So you have a large number here for producers, getting smaller and smaller as you go up to each of the consumers, where as you weigh everything at each level, it's going to be pyramid shaped with the smallest amount at the top and the largest amount at the bottom. As we know from the previous food webs, life is pretty complicated. Looking at living things, everything has some interdependence, meaning all living things are connected to other living things directly or indirectly, whether they're being eaten or eating other things, or they get their chemical energy from other living things, or their actions affect other organisms. Everything is interdependent and interconnected. Speaking of which, let's talk GPP and NPP. GPP is an acronym for gross primary productivity, meaning all the light energy that is converted to chemical energy in an ecosystem. So basically, all the carbohydrates that these plants produce. Obviously, not all of it is available to consumers because the plants need some of it to grow and create leaves and seeds and reproduce. Net primary productivity, or NPP, is the actual chemical energy that's available to those things that are going to eat it. So what's not used by the plant that's then passed to its consumers. The way that net primary productivity is expressed is sometimes in energy per unit area per time. For example, joules per meter squared per year. So you look at a sample plot of a meter in length and width over a year's time and how much of that energy is produced. Another way is by looking at the mass or new mass created. So the vegetation that's created per area per time. So for example, these trees, the new tree growth would be added up, and that would be the total, or the biomass net primary productivity, and it would be measured in grams per meter squared per year. Now, of course, total biomass is called the standing crop, but it's, again, all that new vegetation added. So forests might have a really high total biomass, but a relatively low net primary productivity because not many new leaves are actually added, or new needles or height to the trees per year. It's new growth. Here from the book, you can see ecosystems with really high net primary productivity. For example, rainforests that are growing really fast, estuaries that produce a huge amount seasonally, coral reefs, and of course out in the open ocean, mainly because the planet is just covered with this stuff. The open ocean, 71% of our surface area, and lots of algae out there. All right, question 6 to put in your notes, and 7. Choose, first of all, question 6. Choose one word to represent what this part of the chapter is all about. One word, and finally explain why you chose that word. Be thorough in your explanation. I will check these off. Thank you.